Colleagues, a very, very good morning to everybody who has joined us here this morning. It's my privilege to welcome all of you today. We've been looking forward to this important discussion for some time. And thank you for joining our very first COVID-19 NPO survey webinar. Colleagues, please would you make yourselves known according to the instructions that you would have received this morning. We would love to acknowledge you and welcome you. You can please just give your name, your surname, and your organization. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Colleagues, my name is Gill Bates, and it's my privilege to be the CEO of CAF Southern Africa and also to be your facilitator at this morning's very important discussion. I would like to welcome each and every one of you to our call this morning. Thank you for making time to join this discussion. We're very mindful of how critically busy all of you are at this time in our country. And I'm so pleased to be able to share the findings of our recent COVID-19 NPO survey, which we conducted during May and June this year. This was also in collaboration with our CAF UK colleagues in our London office and also with Fox Street Communications, who assisted with getting the polling out and to get your thoughts and feelings. Colleagues, this process was conducted in order to help us understand the COVID-19 global pandemic, which has impacted on the lives of NPOs, both South Africa and internationally. And it's for us to understand how these changes are unfolding, obviously being mindful that things are constantly changing in the space. This polling also enables us to get a pulse on how the sector is responding and coping to such challenging times. Colleagues, our grateful thanks must go to you, the NPOs, who shared and participated willingly and gave your insights and thoughts into the polling process. As I said, we need to also thank colleagues abroad and here who assisted with the dissemination of the polling, Fox Street Communication, to Resource Alliance, thank you Sarah Scarf, and to Fundraising Talk, thank you Kelvin, Glen, for making sure that the survey went out far and wide to your extended networks. Colleagues, these findings in many ways resonate with the report that we released in February 2020, entitled The Growing Giving Report in South Africa. Ironically, these recommendations and thoughts were to be eerily similar to the ones that we are seeing now. Colleagues, before I proceed to the findings, it is also my privilege to introduce you firstly to our two speakers today. Ms. Brenda Nkosi-Bakare, who heads up Group Social Investment and Community at Sasol. Thank you, Brenda, for your time this morning. And Kelvin Glen, who is co-founder at KhulumaSA and an independent executive director. Kelvin, thank you for your time and your thoughts and insights. Brenda and Kelvin will be sharing their perspectives from the corporate and civil society spaces, respectively. Colleagues, very mindful of time, and we are wanting to allow space at the end of this debate to get your thoughts and feelings and your responses and your experiences. So I'm now going to proceed directly to the findings of the 5 polling questions that we sent out. Gareth, can I request the first slide? Thank you so much. Colleague, the very first question that we asked, and this was sent out on the 7th of May 2020, we received 83 responses. And our question was simply this: keeping going in the crisis, how is your organization coping? Now, this was really essentially to get a sense, colleagues, of how long organizations would be able to be operational, assuming that no extra help became available, either from government or elsewhere. How long, we asked, do you think your NPO can operate in its current form, given the current crisis that is unfolding in the country? Obviously, colleagues, at the time, we were very well aware that the impact of COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown in South Africa was still unfolding. Early indications from the survey, however, will indicate very worrying signs about the NPOs that were surveyed and their ability to keep going. The short answer, colleagues, is that the vast majority of NPOs indicated that they did not think that they could survive beyond 6 months. which is a most worrying finding indeed. Colleagues, moving on to the second question very quickly. This question was released on the 1st of June 2020. We received 32 responses. The question was posed, what do you need from government? This after 2 months under lockdown. The responses were received were as following. Number one, government policies need to enable giving. And that was a very, very strong theme in polling too. Secondly, non-profit organizations were calling for unconditional cash grants. Thirdly, the most desperate need was for PPE for both staff and volunteers. And finally, NPOs were calling for resources such as food, medicine, and shelter to be available immediately on an urgent basis. The third question, colleagues, was sent out on the 18th of June. And on this day, we received 73 responses. The question was this: how has your NPO adapted? And we saw an incredible amount of innovation and creativity from the non-profit sector as they responded to the unfolding crisis. Obviously, all officers then had to change to work remotely. All officers found new ways to reach beneficiaries and also found alternative ways to deliver services to their beneficiaries. Some organizations started emergency funding and fundraising. However, other organizations were sadly unable to work remotely, and in many instances, service delivery stopped altogether. Colleagues, moving on to the fourth poll. This was released on the 23rd of June, 2020, and we received 117 responses. The question was, has your organization received any new financial or non-financial support during the lockdown? We saw that 42% received new and once-off donations from individuals. Some 27% have seen new donations from high net worth individuals, and 25% of NPO surveys have seen new donations from corporate donors. 1 in 5 nonprofits have had existing financial support repurposed for pandemic-related activities. 21% experienced the retraction of financial support. 33% of NPO surveys have not received any new forms of financial support at all during the crisis. Moving on to non-financial support, we found that 33% had received donations of goods such as food, clothing, or PPE from both individuals and corporates. 20% received volunteer support from individuals. And colleagues, we cannot stress the importance of volunteering and non-financial aid. 1 in 6 organizations, or 17%, had seen individuals or community groups support by promoting the services of NPOs on social media. And 16% have seen support refocused or repurposed. 34%, colleagues, received no new support during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our final survey poll, colleagues, looked at government support during the pandemic. And this is very, very critical, the findings that were returned to us. This poll was released on the 13th of July and had 20 respondents. And it was very clear to us as we analysed these findings that many South African NPOs feel that they have been able to advocate for support during this crisis. However, many also feel that they do not have the support of the government, particularly during this period. They also do not agree that they are seen by government as essential in this pandemic, not responding, not just despite the majority seeing an increase in demand for their services as a result of the crisis. Many have or intend to apply for emergency grant funding. However, there is clear disagreement that government measures have enabled NPOs and NGOs to access new sources of funding or have made it easier for them to respond in the crisis. There is strong agreement that measures have made it, in fact, quite difficult for them to respond. And that was the very strong voice amongst the 20 non-profits that returned responses. There is general agreement that non-profit organizations are not really aware of any government support aimed specifically at supporting civil society during this crisis. Colleague, these are very, really sobering and worrying findings indeed. As I say, they really echo the findings of a similar report released earlier. And as we digest these findings, colleagues, I will now request that our two speakers share their insights and experience before we open this conversation and this debate to yourselves. Kelvin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. Kelvin has had 28 years of experience in civil society, corporate affairs, holding various leadership positions at an executive level. Kelvin has been a board member, a colleague, and a great friend and supporter of CAFSA and civil society. And Kelvin, as you will see, is very passionate in all he does in his work to support civil society. Kelvin, a great pleasure to welcome you with us here this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Gill. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. So the irony is tomorrow, being the 26th of August, will be 5 months since we went into lockdown with COVID-19. In my experience of nearly 3 decades of working in the sector, I never, ever in a lifetime anticipated that we would face the challenges, the dynamics of what we're facing. Not only in South Africa, but globally, the sector is in turmoil, both the charity sector and the funding sector. So we sit with a very difficult situation. And I'm going to reflect on what I call the 4 Rs, which is response, resilience, repositioning, and rebuilding. And naturally, as the disaster happened, in the true civil society manner, we all jumped in, rolled up our sleeves, and did whatever we could to help our fellow human being, whether it was here or anywhere around the world. Some of our challenges with that was that this was not just a South African challenge. This was not just a SADC or an African challenge. This is a global pandemic, which means that the entire world had to respond to something that none of us ever anticipated, and the types of things you would only see in science fiction movies. Many, many charities were not prepared, not for the lack of being planning, not for the lack of doing strategy, but just for the lack of the pure volume of having to respond to a global pandemic all at the same time. As South Africa, we faced many, many challenges as civil society, with the uncertainty, with the funding challenges, with the then added challenges of lockdown, and having to protect our own volunteers and staff. The volunteers themselves that were in the field, that were at the coalface, that were at the front line of this battle, were not prepared as far as PPE, training, resources, and that took a lot of money, time, and effort to make sure that the ladies and gentlemen of our country that had given up their time to volunteer to go help a fellow human being were sufficiently equipped and trained. And to this day, there are still a number of charities that are in the field every single day, tirelessly, 7 days a week, 24/7, working with communities to empower and support and try and suppress the rate of COVID. The research was really, really interesting for me to see what the response was from civil society as far as a response. I also believe that there is a much bigger game to play here as far as psychosocial support, long-term impact on our economy, on donor funding, on capacity and ability in the civil society space, and most importantly, working with our beneficiaries. Charities already were dealing with challenges of insufficient funding, insufficient resources, supply versus demand, and now they were faced with this additional challenge. Many, many charities had to stop operations, had to change how they were operating, had to adjust, redesign programs, and that brought its own complexity. So my thanks to CAF and the Global Alliance and everybody that was part of the survey. I think it just shows the unbelievable resilience that we as a sector have to stand together, to support each other, and to share data. I was a little bit disappointed in the numbers. I think that it would have been great if we'd had more responses from the charity sector. And in future surveys, we really appeal to everybody to take the 10 minutes out of your day to respond to the questions, because this helps us shape and educate, lobby, advocate, create awareness, and it gives us data to work with. Because unfortunately, unlike European countries where you've got bodies that actually govern the charity sector in Africa and South Africa specifically is really not represented well enough from a governance perspective. So when these surveys go out, it's really important that we all share the data so that we do have the statistics to put on government's desk, to put on the donors' desk, to put out into the public space, to say to the public, hey, you guys are being great, this is what we need, and it gives us an umbrella or a global picture of what is happening in our country. So onto the resilience. I saw amazing models and I saw amazing work from charities where they were just showed absolute resilience in bringing together their teams, their volunteers, their donors, and going in and dealing with this challenge in communities in some very, very difficult and tough circumstances. So I think that we need to commend the resilience shown by the charity sector and the donor sector, who just threw out all the policies, some of them threw out all the rules, because they realized that we may have planned to fund certain programs, but we're going to have to adjust. We also saw an unbelievable outpouring from society, not only corporates, individuals, volunteers, service groups, churches, corporates. And it really was overwhelming some days to see the amazing response from society, where they entrusted the charity sector to be the frontline soldiers in fighting this pandemic. On to repositioning. I think that the biggest challenge for the sector was to reposition themselves, to adjust to the new normal, to adjust from working remotely, from having extra layers of protection and processes and safety and health for their teams and their communities. And also the impact on the beneficiaries, because programs that were reliant on facilities like schools and churches and youth groups and facilities where they ran programs or did feeding programs in those communities had to reposition themselves and do it differently, taking into account social distancing and all the protection that was needed. But it was still done, and they found very innovative ways. We've also seen some great innovation around technology and reporting, which I think is some good that's come out of this, is we've got some great innovation, some M&E tools that we can use going forward to enhance our service delivery to the sector. Lastly, rebuilding. I think that that's probably going to be the hardest thing. We're still in the midst of this. We are only reaching our bump now, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. But the rebuilding beyond COVID-19, the rebuilding beyond this pandemic, the rebuilding to the new normal, the rebuilding with our donors, our individual givers, and our own teams, as well as our beneficiaries, is going to take a huge amount of work. So my plea to everybody that's listening today is we need to be kind to each other. We need to give each other the space and the time to navigate through this unknown, uncharted waters. And we need to hold hands and walk together, because none of us can do this alone. And the research is telling us that there's a lot of disappointment with government. I understand that, but I think it's also an opportunity for us as a collective to put on the table with government just how important civil society is and the important role that the donors and civil society have played in facing this pandemic, delivering services, and supporting our communities and our economy. So for me, a couple of observations. The positive, I'll start with the negatives. Obviously, a lot of charities, as we've shown in the research, did not have sufficient reserves to go beyond 6 months, and that's a big concern. It's also a lesson learned for the charities and the donor sector that charities need to build up those reserves so that when the next crisis hits, they're not faced with the same challenge. Government relationships, which is a concern, and I've spoken about. I think resources is another big challenge for the sector, as far as did they have enough resources? How did they have to redeploy their resources? And their resources have been really stretched. I know of charities that have worked tirelessly 7 days a week since this pandemic started, and their team have not had a day off. They are reaching burnout. Their families haven't seen them. There's animal welfare charities where the staff have lived at the welfare shelter for the animals since lockdown because they had to look after the animals, and they haven't seen their families. So people have sacrificed unbelievably, not only in giving, but in also giving time and resources. We've had a wonderful outpouring of volunteerism, which was fantastic. The other negative is obviously the uncertainty of now and the future. It's put a scare to everybody about how do we navigate through this, what is beyond this, how do we recover from this, how do we learn from this, and most importantly is how do we get back to normal and the new normal. The positives out of the research when I looked at it was phenomenal collaboration. My phone hasn't stopped since COVID started with people saying, hey, you know this person, I need to connect with this person, we need to work together. Do you know somebody working in rural Northern Cape? Because we don't want to send stuff there and there's nobody to support us. Or we've got a donor that wants to support in Eastern Cape. How can we connect with people? Donors have collaborated. Civil society has collaborated. Churches and corporates have collaborated. Communities have collaborated. So I think that's a really great positive, that we can pat ourselves on the back and say, we haven't lost our humanity and we've stood together to support each other. There's been an outpouring of support. The overwhelming number of support for people where they gave their last 50 Rand to help their fellow human being. They are donating goods, they're donating time, they're donating vehicles, they're donating space, researchers, free IP systems. So the outpouring of giving has just been phenomenal. And I think we need to sit back and recognize that and put a value to that as well, because we also need to try to understand how much has been given, not only in money, but in time and resources as well. Donor acquisitions have been phenomenal. We've seen a lot more individual donors coming on board with charities, and it's in the research where charities saw an increase of giving from individuals, which is great. And I think globally, COVID-19 has unlocked the great potential of individual giving across the globe, and that everyone can afford to support in one way, shape, or form. And I think that's phenomenal. That the good out of that is that people have given what they can, and charities have built their databases and their donor acquisitions, which is phenomenal. Lastly, the leadership. This pandemic and this crisis has really given us the opportunity for leaders to shine. And we've seen some phenomenal leadership in the organizations, in government, and in civil society. Despite the criticism of government, government has shown leadership in the sense that they are doing what they can do with what they've got. Donors have shown unbelievable leadership in just rolling up their sleeves and saying, how can we help? Civil society has shown great leadership where we've seen leaders rising, we've seen teams being developed, we've seen teams taking on more responsibility, unapologetically, not expecting more and just giving more. So for me, the lessons out of this research and out of this entire exercise, and thank you again to CAFSA and everyone that participated, because it gives us a really nice helicopter view. So what I'm taking away from this is how important fundraising and communications is, because the charity sector had to put their appeal campaigns out, had to communicate to the donor sector and to society at large about what they were doing, create awareness about the need of the communities they were serving. So it really, really gave us an opportunity to test our fundraising and communications ability. And I think hats off to every single organization globally, especially in South Africa. Our colleagues have really worked tirelessly to create that awareness, put together fantastic programs, and give the donor community, whether that's individuals, crowdfunding, or corporates, the opportunity to partner with them to serve those in need, whether it was PPE in hospitals, feeding schemes, animal shelters, whatever. We've also seen an increase in crowdfunding campaigns now that lockdown's been released. And I'm really excited to see how many more people are wanting to give and how innovative and creative charities have been about their fundraising campaign. So hats off to every single one of the charities for being creative and innovative. And thank you to every single donor that has given, whether it's R1 or R1,000,000, you have made a difference and you've helped a fellow human being in these very difficult times that we are facing. So lastly, let's keep it going. Let's not lose momentum. Let's not lose vision. And most importantly, let's take the lessons learned out of this, better ourselves so that we can create a better South Africa for everybody and keep as many charities and community-based organizations open during these very, very difficult times. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my experience of COVID-19. And thank you again to CAFSA for putting this together and creating this amazing platform.
Kelvin, thank you so much for that. Your energy is absolutely tangible. Your presentation was inspiring and pragmatic, and thank you. It really assists us as we grapple with a civil society that is a landscape that is forever changed. Thank you for your call to action. I got from you the focus and emphasis on resilience. I think you're absolutely right. I think civil society has demonstrated its resilience over decades in our country. I think, as you say, collaboration is king now more than ever. We should not lose sight of the importance of the currency of non-financial contributions, such as time and goods. We don't calculate those, we don't measure those. And as you say, thank you for that reminder. And I think for me, of critical importance, aside from everything else that you shared, Kelvin, was for us to bear in mind the social impacts, the psychosocial impacts of this pandemic, and the great many people in the front line or wherever colleagues are working. There are psychosocial costs which we need to be mindful of and make provision for. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, Kelvin, much appreciated. Colleagues, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Brenda Nkosi-Bakare, who heads up Group Social Investment and Community at Sasol. Brenda, as many of you know, is a keen advocate for collaboration between the corporate sector and civil society in her work at Sasol. It's been my great privilege to work with Brenda in this space, and we are so looking forward to your insights, Brenda, and you are very, very warmly welcomed here today.
More everyone, I see a number of people on the line. You know, one of my colleagues who is a board member in the Sasol Global Foundation said to us, you know, when we're grappling with the challenges that we faced, you know, with COVID-19, he said to us, never lose sight, you know, and never mess around with a good crisis. So we have a crisis on our hands, and it's up to us to say, what is it that we are going to do, you know, in this crisis? Are we going to take the baton and run and make it to change the way we think, the way we work, the way we do things? Or are we going to sit around and say, this has been a challenge and we are so, we are in despair, you know, we can't move, we can't do anything. And I think for all of us, we want to take the first option, which is, how do we take this crisis and make it an opportunity? And how do we utilize it for the benefit of ourselves, our organizations, our country, our world, but also our future? You know, so I think this is the premise that I would like us to focus on. And maybe coming from the private sector or from the business sector, but working very closely with civil society. You know, firstly, just to say thanks to CAF for the survey that they have done. Gill and team are doing great work. I mean, we've been working with them for a number of years, and we get amazed at the work that they do. But the most important thing that has come out of the survey, Gill, which is one of the things that we have actually seen as part of our work, that we have done as Sasol in our fence line communities globally. One of the things that we have learned is that a lot of civil society groups have really struggled during the pandemic. And part of the reason why they have struggled is because the industry itself has been under a lot of pressure. So we know that the companies have been under a lot of pressure when the pandemic broke, and the sectors kind of closed globally and we all stopped working. There's a point where there was an overflow, of fuel globally. I mean, countries were almost at a point where they were paying people to actually take their fuel and store it for them because we didn't have a place or, a demand for the fuel that we actually had. So one of the reasons I just want to focus, especially from the private sector, is to say, while civil society really felt the impact of COVID-19, likewise, the private sector felt the impact. However, there has been a lot of good things that have come out, and those are some of the things I'm going to share with you in the next 10 minutes that I have with you. So one of the things that I just want to share with you is what has COVID-19 presented all of us, that we need to take from and actually make an opportunity, as my board member had said. So I would like us to just look at two things, what are some of the challenges and what has been some of the opportunities that we can actually add, and what are the lessons that we can learn, and what can we do to make sure that going forward we are more resilient, as Kelvin has said, but also we are adaptable to whatever situation that we come up with. So some of the challenges, and as most of us would know, and as Gill has actually mentioned, that we have faced is that a lot of companies have laid off staff. There has been a lot of resources that were not utilized because there were no movements. There were points where the borders were closed globally, so we couldn't move anything to outside of the country, and things were not coming in the country as well, and that impacts our economy as a country, but also it impacts the global economy. So those are some of the things, and as a result of that, there was a loss of revenue, but also a lot of people lost their jobs. Those that stayed with their jobs, they had a lot, some of them had salaries cut, some didn't have salaries. Most of us would know from the families that we come from. However, COVID-19 also presented us with a number of opportunities. And I would like us to also talk about some of those opportunities and say, as civil society, as charities, as NPOs, how do we also just take advantage of some of those opportunities? And one of the opportunities that we saw coming, and we as Sasol also utilized, is the importance of collaboration. We actually went beyond our normal call of duty to make sure that we collaborate. Some of you might know there's an initiative we got involved in the Val, which is called A Million Food, for our communities. So what we proposed to do was to partner with stakeholders in the Val to give 1 million food. And the reason is because, from the study that Gill had said, and from also our needs from the community, we saw that there was a lot of need for food, a lot of need. And NPOs needed money, which is cash, but most organizations or companies did not have cash to give. And then we had to be innovative, to say, what is it that we do together to make sure that we meet some of these needs that we have, both as the business, but also as communities and civil society. So collaboration was the way to go for us. To date, we've probably given almost half 500,000 of the food packs that were required, and we have exceeded the target that we had because we wanted to actually do this until July, but we decided that let's continue doing this until, I mean, we have a sustainable program. So there's a sustainable program on the ground in the Val, you know, for food security for community members as a result of this pandemic. So that's why I'm saying, whilst we look at some of the challenges, let's look at opportunities. And one of the things that COVID has really presented with all of us is that what are the new ways of working? Is it still sustainable to want to see each other daily? You know, and what are the new skills that we are learning as a country, as a community, as civil society to enable us to be resilient and to thrive and continue despite, you know, the challenges that may come. And none of us would have anticipated what COVID brought. However, it has brought new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. And as part of that, we're probably going to save a bit of money because we're not going to rent space anymore. We can work remotely. And then it says to us, do we have partnerships maybe with some of the service providers who can give us data? So those are some of the things we start thinking about. You know, what are the skills that we are learning, this that are required by the country that business is interested in investing in? So those are some of the things we must think about also from a civil society group to say, what is it that we can contribute to sustain ourselves, to sustain the country, but also to sustain, you know, the economy that we have as a people. And then one of the other things, I mean, I've mentioned innovation, which is one of the key things. But the other thing that I would like to give you as an example is that when COVID hit us, we as Sasol went on the ground and we looked for non-governmental organizations and small businesses who can develop PPE, you know, that was required in communities. Some were very agile, and that's one of the things that a crisis requires. It requires agility. So you need to ask yourself, are you agile enough to be able to do what is required when it's required? So we were able to work with some of the organizations on the ground, you know, to actually turn around, you know, the masks that we required, some of the sanitation that we needed, because Sasol has given over 300,000 liters of sanitizer, of which 240,000 was done in South Africa and then 60,000 in Mozambique. However, all that sanitizer was manufactured by a small business in South Africa that we developed. But the good thing is the business was agile enough, you know, to be able to do that, and we trained them and they developed it. I mean, we did masks also in Secunda through our businesses. But for me, the critical thing that I want to say is, do you look at some of those opportunities and do you present them to the industry so that they see that this is what is required and then they can actually pay for? And one of the things we've always advocated as Sasol, you know, to non-governmental organizations is that whilst you do get funding, look for something that will keep your business sustainable. You know, even if it's a small, you know, more like a social enterprise. So something that will help you to be sustainable. Whether you print books, whether you do education, so that if we need to communicate to our stakeholders on the ground, we utilize your services because we are there as companies and we are willing to do that. However, we need to know that you are also agile enough, but also have experience enough, because we need people who can do the best work that we don't want to pay maybe big business for. We would rather pay someone who is local. So for me, those are some of the opportunities that COVID has presented, and it has really made some organizations to benefit to a certain point, and others which was amazing to us. We did give them some businesses, and some came back and said we can't deliver, you know. And so those are some of the things that we need to think about today. Are we positioned enough to be able to do that? And I think organizations like CAF, you know, and others can assist you if you think you are not ready to get to that point. I'm sure they can support you and say to you, how do you get there? So I think for me, it is really critical that, to Kevin's point, during COVID, there are critical things we need to do. Number one is the whole issue of bonds. How do we respond? But also, are we willing to ensure that in our response, we still show humanity? You know, we need to still show humanity and Ubuntu towards each other. It can be a dog eat dog, you know, kind of a situation. Let's show humanity, collaborate, work together, and do what we need to do for the benefit of our civil society, our communities, you know, the business, but also the country that we live in. And we know we can't depend on government. They have their own issues, but we can work with them to make sure that everything works. And then lastly, I think it's very important that as we move on, we need to ask ourselves, have we adapted to the new normal? Because this is a new normal for all of us. And if we have not, what are we doing to make sure that we adapt? So thank you very much. Thanks, Gill. I hope that a lot of questions will be asked, and then we'll be willing to answer some of those questions.
Brenda, thank you so much for your thoughts and your reflections, and I especially appreciated your advice to never waste a good crisis. Our CEO in London also echoed those sentiments as he advised us that, you know, disasters like this can either make us bitter or better. So thank you so much for those reflections. Collaboration, I think Sasol has really demonstrated that very strongly and always has. We were especially pleased to be able to partner with yourselves in the distribution of the hand sanitizers that you spoke about, especially to those non-profits involved in gender-based violence work, especially prevalent during August, which is Women's Month. Thank you for that. You spoke to flexibility, a fast response, that we need to be innovative and learn new skills. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think, Brenda, the research has also shown us that in many ways, as you observed, we were not in a state of readiness, even prior to the advent of COVID. And I think Kelvin expressed that as a concern as well. So those are really especially important insights, and a sharp reminder again that we really need to be collaborating together, because as Kelvin noted, no one sector can do this alone. So thank you so much to our speakers, our experts, for sharing those insights, advice, learnings, and takeaways for us today. I'm especially grateful to you both. And colleagues, we now are able to open the discussion to the floor, and we're looking forward to receiving your questions, your comments, your debate, your concerns. And just to kick off with, Kelvin, can I just ask you, I wonder, you've studied this report in depth and at this research, and you're very close to it. Could I ask you, is there anything that surprised you or didn't surprise you in terms of these findings?
Thank you, Joel. Thank you for the question. And I'm going to apologize in case dogs bark, because there's something going on in the neighborhood. So yeah, I think to poll number 3, which was how's your organization adapted, I am really pleased to see the findings that organizations were so great at being resilient and adapting. You know, things like change from working physically to remotely, that's not easy. Find alternative ways to deliver services. I've heard of some fantastic case studies and read some fantastic case studies of collaboration, of churches working with charities to pack parcels, of charities working with the department and local communities, and also communities just being reached that have never been reached before. So I think poll 3 has really shown us that we really can adapt. As you said, we can make the best of this crisis. The third finding of found new ways to reach beneficiaries. That's fantastic. Started an emergency fundraising campaign, which was great. And then lastly, developed that collaboration. So I think poll number 3 has surprised me, that I am always surprised at just how open civil society is to work together despite being competitors from a funding perspective, they collaborated, they've worked together, they've shared funding, they've shared resources, they've shared links. I mean, we've seen some great stuff on technology about people saying, I've heard about this fund, you know, people must apply. And then the second thing that really surprised me was poll number 4, which was, has your organization received any new financial or non-financial support? I think this is really, really great, because what it does is it shows us that of the 117 that responded, 42% received a once-off donation from an individual that had not supported them before. 27% received a donation from a high net worth individual or a family trust. And 25% received a donation from corporations. This is fantastic information, ladies and gentlemen, because what it's telling us is that society wants to give. The lesson for civil society and the charity sector is, if you don't ask, you don't get. So it just shows, if you communicate effectively, timeously, you can demonstrate impact, and you can show resilience, that the donor community wants to support you. And that demonstrates to us that it's individuals, whether it's a gift or a financial contribution, plus corporations. The great thing that's come out of this is that those organizations have now increased their donor base. And I'm hoping and praying that those organizations are building relationships with those donors, and are continuing to work with those donors on a donor stewardship program to enhance their giving. And hopefully those donors will continue to support that charity going forward in their work in the years to come. So that's what surprised me, as far as I didn't expect to see these numbers. So I'm really, really happy about that. Yeah, so thank you for that question, Gill.
Thank you so much, Kelvin. Thank you for that response. Colleagues, we have a question from our colleague Stuart. Stuart, good to see you on the call. And Stuart's raised a very important question. Stuart is quite correctly observing that the non-profit sector is essentially overtraded in the South African space. And Stuart is challenging us about collaboration in the space. And I'd like to get your thoughts also, Brenda and Kelvin. And I think Stuart is absolutely correct. How do we collaborate in times where there are decreasing resources and increased demand for services? How can we be flexible and innovative and work together when effectively we are all in a state of competition, as you like? How do we move more to a collaborative space that we've all talked about this morning? And it's a great question, Stuart. Thank you so much for that. Kelvin, your thoughts?
Thank you, Gill. Thank you, Stuart, for that question. Really good question. And I agree with Stuart, but I also feel that the charity sector needs to take a step back and needs to challenge themselves about collaboration, cooperation, cooperatives, working models. And as Brenda said, you've got to make the best of a good crisis. So given the financial situation the country's finding itself in, the economy, which is going to take years to recover, now is the time. And I'm telling all my charity clients, if you have not gone back and re-looked at your strategy, you are going to be left behind. The boards and the leadership team of every charity in this country needs to be having a very, very honest and hard conversation with themselves, with their beneficiaries, and basically saying, are we still relevant given what we're facing and what the future holds? And if we're not, what are we going to do? Where can we collaborate? Also, out of that strategy, there needs to come your business plan and your fundraising plan, because that's got to change as well. And I would encourage also, I've said to all of my clients, pick up the phone and call your donors, because the other challenge, and it's a tidal wave that has not hit us yet, ladies and gentlemen, but as Brenda rightly said, the donor sector, being the corporate, has also been knocked badly with COVID-19. So for us to presume that there's going to be the same level of corporate social responsibility funding in 2021 and 2022 and 2023, we are being naive. So charities need to also start planning for next financial year and the next 2 or 3 years and saying to their donors, are you still on board? Or are you on board 50%? If so, we need to adjust our program or find that funding somewhere else. So I think, Stuart, great question. And the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is a wake-up call. Both the donor community and civil society need to start having good conversations with each other and changing their models appropriately.
Kelvin, thank you so much for that insight. I think you're absolutely spot on. And Brenda, I know that Sasol, this has been a concern for Sasol as well. And you've run masterclasses, you've been very mindful around getting your non-profit organizations into a sustainable space, helping organizations even look at procurement, at governance, etc. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Gill. Yes, and you know, one of the things that we have always said is a lot of charities or NPOs who get or do not get funding from corporates, the critical thing is governance. You know, your structures, your governance, your policies, procedures, your vision in terms of what is it that you want to achieve, so your plans. And it cannot be overemphasized, you know, the whole issue of collaboration. And for me, why we need to get the charity or civil society sector also collaborating is you need to look at what resources, but also, okay, the first thing is, what is your vision? What is it that you want to achieve? And then you partner with people that have the same vision, because that is where it begins. And then you develop the strategy together that will lead you to do something that will make a difference. But you need to look at what resources do I have versus my partner that I want to partner with. And then you can then leverage some of the resources that the other partner has, which you do not have. So you mustn't see that as a competition, but see that as a strength that will enable you to be stronger and to be able to benefit. So for me, I think practically, these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves as far as collaboration is concerned, but also to say, are we geared? Are we strong enough? Is our governance, is our risk mitigation plan, is our action plan and roadmap clear enough for a donor to be able to support me? Because it doesn't matter how much money the corporate sector has. They're just not going to throw it away. We all do that. We check your governance, and that is why it is imperative for us also as Sasol to build the NPO sector through the organizations like CAF to make sure that your governance is intact, you know, your strategy is intact, you meet the minimum requirements. And then when it comes to delivery, we can help you. I mean, we can support you in other ways that we can support you. But if your governance is not in place, we don't even look at you. So for us, that is really critical, Gill. Gill, you are on mute.
Brenda, thank you so much for that. And thank you for your comments, which are especially helpful as we all try to be flexible and resilient and pivot during the navigation of such uncharted waters. Colleagues, our time together is drawing to a close, but I would encourage anybody with any additional questions or thoughts to please post your questions to the user CAFSA in the left-hand panel. But in the interim, colleagues, I wanted to share just at a very high level the recommendations we receive from our non-profit civil society leaders, a research report that we released in February 2020, just ahead of the onslaught of COVID-19. And these recommendations were almost prophetic, colleagues. Our colleagues in the non-profit sector at the time called for an enabling environment, particularly from a policy perspective in terms of giving and philanthropy. At that time, just before lockdown and COVID, non-profit organizations were calling for an increase in unconditional grants. Also a call for the relaxation of stringent reporting requirements. We've spoken about governance and compliance. We're very mindful of the need to be diligent in that perspective, but there is a balance to be found in our experience. We need to be balancing as funders and philanthropists speed and agility together with governance. So I think hitting that sweet spot is absolutely critical. And also the research in February spoke to the importance of the need for non-financial giving. Already then, non-profits were recording the value of non-financial contributions such as time, in terms of volunteering, in terms of goods. So these findings for us were absolutely critical as we've seen the country move into a hard lockdown, and as we've moved further into the managing of the COVID-19 pandemics. Colleagues, I'm looking at the time, and very sadly our time is just about up. I think just to sum up, the rich dialogue and discussions today are for me a very sharp reminder that now, possibly more than ever before in our young democracy, civil society remains a critical pillar of that society and must be supported. Your voices must be heard, colleagues, and our findings and your thoughts shared today really greatly assist us to deepen our practice as thought leaders and practitioners in this space. These findings also, as I said, echo the recommendations of the Growing Giving in South Africa report released in February 2020. Colleagues, your attendance and your input today has been especially valuable as we continue to collaborate together to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Your voice is critically important as we work together to build a strong and resilient civil society. Colleagues, a call to action and a request: please do continue to give your inputs and your insights into our surveys and into our research reports. I know this is a little time consuming, especially given how very, very busy you are right now, but your inputs, as you've seen, are absolutely critical. We hear your voices, we document each and every response, and this assists us to really build a body of knowledge and to advise those corporate philanthropy decision makers with evidence-based research. We will share this podcast, colleagues, today with yourselves, as well as this report that we put together with you, for you, and also the other reports that you can find on our website. Please do look out for the next round of surveys. These are going to be especially critical as we are now further into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we need to keep a pulse on what is happening in civil society, the impacts, the challenges, the responses, so that we can build a body of knowledge, of learnings, of best practice, so that we can negotiate the difficult days ahead. Please watch out for notifications on our various social media platforms. Colleagues, all that is left for me to say is to thank our speakers for their insights and their experience. I really do appreciate the time. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Kelvin. And to Fox Street Communications, thank you so much for being our technical and media support on this, our very first podcast in respect of COVID-19. We're very excited to have had such a great attendance today. I'm looking at the numbers and I'm really so thrilled to see so many of you participating today. There will be more, so please do look out for notifications. And colleague, please keep up the great work that each and every one of you are doing. Our country is the richer for your efforts. I know that the road ahead is hard and you are tired, but we want to say, please keep up the good work and continue to fight the good fight. And we will look forward to welcoming you to future podcasts of this nature. Thank you, colleagues. Please stay safe and well, and a very good afternoon to you all.